the charity hall, the lights were warm and golden, yet the air carried a strange coldness that only the poor children could feel. They stood quietly on the side of the stage, wearing clothes that were too big or too small. Some people in the audience clapped politely, while others only came to watch as if it was another show for them. In the middle of the noise and laughter, a man walked in. He was tall, with a strong face and expensive suit. Everyone whispered about him because he was the CEO of a famous company. He was known for his money and his power. People often said that when he spoke, others listened. The CEO looked around with a smile that was not kind but playful. He enjoyed surprising people and showing that his words could change lives. On the side of the stage, his eyes caught a small girl. She was thin like a shadow. Her dress was worn out and her hair was messy, as if no one had brushed it for a long time. She stood beside an old piano. The wood of the piano was scratched, and the keys were yellowed with age. It looked like it had been forgotten, just like the girl herself. The girl did not move or speak. She kept her eyes down, as if the world was too heavy to face. Some guests noticed her but quickly lost interest. To them, she was just another orphan, but to the CEO, she was a chance to play a little game. He cleared his throat and raised his voice so the whole hall could hear him. "If she can play the piano," he said with a wide smile, "I will adopt her." The audience gasped and then laughed. Some clapped their hands, thinking it was a wonderful joke. Others whispered to each other, wondering if he was serious. The girl lifted her head slowly. Her big eyes were filled with fear and confusion. She did not understand why this stranger wanted her to play. She had never touched a piano properly in her life. But everyone was looking at her now. Her heart pounded so loudly that she thought people could hear it. She wanted to run and hide, but her legs felt frozen. The CEO's smile grew bigger as he leaned back in his chair. He thought the moment would be fun. Maybe she would surprise everyone with a secret skill, and he would look generous in front of the crowd. Or maybe she would fail and he could laugh it off as a harmless joke. Either way, all eyes were now on him. The girl's hands trembled as she walked toward the piano. Her small shoes made soft sounds on the wooden stage. Each step felt like walking into fire. The crowd grew silent, waiting for her to do something. Some people smirked, ready to laugh. Some children from the orphanage stared with hope, as if her success could mean something good for all of them. The girl reached the piano and looked at the black and white keys. To her, they looked like a puzzle she had never solved. She slowly lifted her hands and hovered over the keys. For a brief moment, she remembered the nights in the orphanage when she had pressed random keys on a broken toy piano. The sound had been strange, but she always wished she could play a real song one day. Now she was standing in front of a real piano, but instead of joy, she felt the heavy weight of expectation. She could feel the CEO's eyes on her. She could feel the audience waiting. She could feel her own heart begging her to stop. Still, she lowered her hands. The first note rang out harsh and uneven. It echoed through the hall and sounded wrong. She pressed another key and another, but the sound grew worse. She tried to make it smoother, but her fingers stumbled. The piano cried out in broken tones. The crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some covered their mouths to hide their laughter. Others shook their heads with pity. The CEO's smile began to fade, but he did not speak. The girl's cheeks turned red. Her vision blurred with tears. Still, she pressed more keys because giving up would feel worse than trying. In that moment, the hall was filled with more than broken music. It was filled with a silent battle. A small girl with nothing but courage was standing against the laughter of the rich and the cold eyes of strangers. The CEO had thrown his words like a stone, but the girl was the one bleeding from the weight of them. She wanted to cry out, to tell them she had never learned, that no one had ever given her a chance. But her voice stayed locked inside her chest. Only her shaking hands spoke for her. The audience waited for the CEO to laugh or change his mind. They waited for the moment when the game would be over. But in that long stretch of seconds, something unexpected happened. The girl's broken notes stopped sounding like failure. They began to sound like truth. The truth of a life without teachers, without kindness, without chances. The truth of a child forced to stand in front of strangers and prove her worth. Her tears slid down her cheeks, but her hands kept moving. And so the hall remained silent except for the uneven sound of the piano. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment, though no one could explain it. The CEO leaned back slowly, his smile gone. The girl looked smaller than ever, yet her courage filled the room. What had begun as a playful challenge had turned into something else, something heavy, something that would not be forgotten easily, and it was only the beginning. The girl's fingers pressed down again, and the sound that came from the piano was rough. It was not the smooth music people expected. Instead, it was like broken glass scattered across a floor, harsh and sharp. The audience shifted in their seats. Some leaned closer, hoping she would suddenly find rhythm. Others leaned back, already losing interest. The girl's shoulders were shaking, her thin arms trembling as she tried to make the music sound right. She pressed one key too hard, and the note cracked loudly through the hall. A few children sitting near the stage whispered to each other. They wanted to cheer for her, but their voices were swallowed by the laughter of some adults. The laughter was quiet at first, just a few chuckles, but it grew. People covered their mouths with their hands, trying not to be too obvious, but their shoulders shook. Some even whispered cruel words. She can't play at all. What a shame. The CEO must regret this joke. The girl could hear every murmur, even if they thought she could not. Each whisper pressed into her chest like a heavy stone. She tried again, moving her fingers faster, thinking maybe if she played quickly it would sound better, but the notes clashed together. They were too sharp, too flat. Nothing sounded like a song. The piano seemed to fight against her, its keys screaming instead of singing. The sound filled the large hall, but instead of beauty it carried discomfort. The audience could not hide their reactions anymore. A man in the back coughed loudly as if to break the tension. A woman shook her head, whispering to her friend about how sad it was. The CEO, who had been leaning forward with a smile in the beginning, now sat with his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed as he watched the small girl struggle. The amusement on his face was gone. He had expected a moment of light entertainment, something that would make him look generous in front of everyone. Instead, he felt a growing irritation. He thought she would at least play something simple, maybe a small melody. Instead, she gave him nothing but chaos. His pride felt bruised, and his jaw tightened as he stared at the piano. The girl's face grew redder with every mistake. She bit her lip to stop it from trembling. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she kept going because stopping felt like losing. Somewhere deep inside her, she thought, maybe if she just kept trying, something would finally sound right. She pressed a soft note, then another, and for a brief second there was silence in the hall. But the silence broke again when two notes clashed so badly that people laughed louder. Her hands froze for a moment, hovering above the keys. Her chest rose and fell quickly as she tried to catch her breath. The sound of laughter spread behind her back like knives cutting into her. She wanted to run from the stage, but her feet were heavy. Her small body looked even smaller under the bright lights of the hall. She wiped her eyes quickly with her sleeve, hoping no one would notice the tears, but of course everyone already did. In the corner of the hall, some of the children from the orphanage clenched their fists. They wanted her to succeed because her success would mean hope for them too. They could not speak up, they could not change anything. All they could do was sit and watch as their friend carried the weight of everyone's judgment. For them, her broken notes were not ugly, they were brave. She was standing in front of the rich and powerful, doing something none of them had dared to do. But the crowd did not see it that way. For them, the music was simply bad. The whispers turned into soft conversations. People shook their heads. Some looked at the CEO to see his reaction, wondering if he would laugh or take back his words. The girl kept her head down, her hair falling into her face, hiding her tears. Her hands trembled as they tried again. But every mistake made the air heavier. The old piano creaked under her, touch, its keys sticking, its sound uneven. It was almost as if the piano itself was mocking her, reminding her that she had no teacher, no lessons, no chance to prepare. Still, she pressed another note, then another, clinging to the hope that something, anything, might sound beautiful. The hall stayed tense, filled with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. Some wanted her to stop, some wanted the CEO to speak, but she continued, too afraid to let go. The CEO finally leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the table in front of him. His smile was gone. replaced by a frown that deepened with every wrong note. He thought about the promise he had made in front of everyone. His pride battled with his irritation. The crowd was watching him almost as much as they were watching the girl, waiting to see if he would keep his word or make an excuse. He clenched his jaw tighter, but he stayed silent. The girl felt his eyes on her, heavy and sharp. She pressed the keys harder, as if trying to drown out his gaze. Her chest hurt, her throat burned, but she refused to stop. Even when the sound came out broken, even when the people whispered, she played. Not because she thought she could win, but because walking away would mean she had given up completely. Her small hands, though clumsy and weak, were filled with a desperate kind of courage. The hall, filled with broken music and cruel laughter, was no longer just a stage. It had become a battlefield, and the girl, with no teacher, no family, no protection, was fighting alone with nothing but her trembling hands. The notes that should have been sweet were bitter. The song that should have been joyful was painful. Yet hidden inside that painful noise was the truth. She was trying with everything she had, and that truth was louder than any laughter, louder than the CEO's frown, louder than the broken keys of the piano. The hall grew heavier with each broken note. The sound was no longer music, but a reminder of her struggle. The laughter that had started small now echoed in cruel ripples across the room. The girl's tiny body shook as she pressed the keys, her face hidden behind messy strands of hair. Her tears fell silently onto the piano, but she did not stop. She believed that stopping would make her look weaker. The CEO's smile, once wide and confident, had faded completely. He sat stiff in his chair, his hands folded tightly. His playful challenge had turned into something uncomfortable. He had wanted to look like a man of power, someone generous and daring, but now he looked like someone who had pushed a child into shame. His pride burned inside him. His plan had gone wrong, and the girl's broken notes exposed him to the judgment of everyone in the hall. People began whispering about him now. Not just the girl. A man leaned to his wife and said, "Why would he say something like that to a child?" Another shook his head and muttered, "It's not right, he made her do this." The CEO heard those words even though they were quiet. His frown deepened. He had not expected the crowd to turn their attention to him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening as if he could bite down his own mistake. The girl tried again, pressing the piano softly this time, hoping maybe a gentle touch would change the sound. For a moment the note was not harsh. It almost carried a sweetness. Her heart lifted for a second, but then her next note clashed badly. The audience let out another round of sighs and quiet chuckles. Her hope broke again, and her shoulders sagged. She whispered to herself so faintly no one could hear, "I'm sorry." The CEO felt those words even without hearing them. He could see her lips move. He could see her shrinking into herself with every mistake, and something inside him twisted. He remembered his own youth when he was laughed at for not having proper clothes. He remembered people mocking his poor accent when he tried to speak in school. Back then he had sworn to never be weak again. He had promised himself he would be powerful enough that no one could laugh at him. Now, as he looked at the girl, he saw himself in her trembling figure. But instead of sympathy, at first he felt anger, not at her but at the situation. He thought, she was supposed to surprise us, not embarrass me. He thought about the promise he had made in front of so many eyes. His pride whispered to him to walk away, to laugh it off, to say he was only joking. But another part of him, a part he had buried long ago, whispered that this was not her fault, that maybe he was the one being tested tonight. The girl's hands finally paused above the keys. She could not play anymore. Her breath came in short gasps, and her tears blurred the piano until it looked like nothing but shadows. The silence that followed was sharp. Everyone waited, some expecting the CEO to speak, others expecting him to laugh. The girl lowered her head and whispered again, "This time a little louder. I never learned." Her voice broke, and the sound cut through the hall like a blade. Those 3 words shook the audience. People glanced at each other. The truth had been spoken. She had never been taught, never been given a chance. How could a child locked away in an orphanage know how to play an instrument that required years of lessons? The laughter stopped, and in its place came an uneasy silence. The weight of guilt pressed down on the room. The girl's courage to stand there, even without skill, began to shine brighter than any polished performance could have. The CEO looked away, shame touching his face for the first time in years. He realized that his playful challenge had not tested her talent, it had tested her heart, and she had shown more bravery than anyone in the room. His frown was no longer just from irritation, but from the sting of self-reflection. He wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had built his life on control, on commanding others, but now a little girl's broken music had silenced him. The girl, still standing by the piano, felt her knees weaken. She wanted to run away, to hide somewhere dark where no one could see her tears. But she stayed because she had no other place to go. The stage was not her choice. It was forced upon her. Her small fingers curled into fists, pressing against her chest as if to hold her heart together. She closed her eyes tightly, waiting for the laughter to start again. Instead, there was only silence. The crowd was not laughing anymore. Some were even wiping their eyes. Others looked down, ashamed of the way they had joined in mocking her. Slowly the air changed. The broken notes that had embarrassed them minutes ago now felt different. They carried the weight of a story they had ignored. The story of a child with no teacher, no family, no support, standing alone on a stage, trying because she was told to try. The CEO's frown deepened, but it was not anger anymore. It was the heavy realization of what he had done. He had placed the weight of his pride on the shoulders of a little girl, and she had carried it, even as her hands trembled. He leaned back, running a hand across his face. The crowd was no longer laughing at her. They were waiting to see what he would do next. His words, once spoken lightly, had become a chain around his neck. He had said he would adopt her if she played, and she had played, and in that heavy silence, it became clear to him that the choice he made now would not just change her life. It would change his. The game he had started had turned into something real, something deeper, something he could not laugh away. And though his pride told him to escape, his heart whispered that maybe, for the first time in years, it was time to keep his word. The girl stood frozen by the piano. Her hands were still above the keys, but she could not play anymore. Her chest moved up and down quickly, as if she had run a long race. The silence in the hall felt heavier than the broken notes she had just played. She could feel hundreds of eyes staring at her, waiting for her to move. Her lips trembled, and finally she whispered, "I never learned." Her voice was so soft, yet it carried across the whole room because the silence was so deep. Her words struck everyone like a stone thrown into still water. The laughter that had filled the air earlier now vanished completely. The crowd did not know what to say. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Some looked at the CEO with accusing eyes. The girl's face was wet with tears. She tried to wipe them with her sleeve, but the more she wiped, the more they came. She wanted to disappear, to hide under the stage or run out the door. But her small legs felt weak. She lowered her head, her hair falling into her face, and her voice cracked again. "But I want to learn." The hall grew even more silent. The words came from her heart. They were not shouted, not forced, just simple and true. For a child who had spent her life in an orphanage, wanting to learn was the same as wanting to live. It was her dream, her hope, her only wish. Some people in the hall felt their hearts twist. A woman covered her mouth with her hand to stop herself from crying. A man whispered to his friend, "She was never given a chance." Another shook his head at the CEO as if blaming him for making a game out of her life. The crowd's mood changed completely. What had begun as entertainment now felt like cruelty. The little girl's tears had exposed the truth. She was not talentless, she was abandoned. The CEO shifted in his chair. His playful confidence was gone. He felt like the lights of the hall were no longer on her, but on him. Everyone was looking at him, waiting to see what he would do. He swallowed hard but did not speak. He wanted to say something sharp to cover his mistake, but the words would not come. For the first time in many years, he felt like a child again, caught doing something wrong. The girl's tears fell onto the piano keys, leaving tiny wet marks that glistened under the lights. She pressed one key softly, not to play but to make a sound. Her voice was shaking, but she whispered again, "Please, I just want to learn." She looked so small and fragile that even the most cold-hearted people in the room felt uneasy. Her voice was not begging for pity, it was begging for a chance that every child deserved. The audience could no longer stay quiet. Some murmured with anger, "This is not right. She should not be forced like this." A few clapped softly as if to encourage her, not because of her music, but because of her bravery. The atmosphere had changed. The girl had walked onto the stage as a shadow, but now she had become the center of the hall, not because of talent, but because of truth. The CEO felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He remembered how he had smiled, proudly at first, how he thought this would be a small joke, a moment to show off his generosity. Now that smile felt like poison. The child's tears cut through his pride sharper than any blade. He clenched his hands on the table in front of him. His chest tightened with something he had not felt in years. Guilt. The girl's small voice echoed in his ears. "I want to learn." He thought about his own past, how he had once wanted to learn but could not, how people had laughed at him when he was poor. The memory burned his heart. And for the first time that night he truly saw her, not as a game, not as a joke, but as a mirror of his old self. The girl's body swayed slightly. She was exhausted. Her courage had carried her this far, but now she was breaking down. A caretaker from the orphanage stood up, ready to take her away. But before she could, the girl grabbed the edge of the piano with trembling hands and whispered, "Don't send me back." Her voice cracked again and fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. The hall gasped softly. Her plea was raw and desperate. It was not about the piano anymore. It was about her life. Her words told everyone the truth. She had nothing. No family, no home, no one to teach her. She was begging not for applause, not for praise, but for love. The silence that followed was painful. Every person in that hall knew the weight of her words. Some were already crying quietly. Some could not even look at her. The CEO closed his eyes for a moment, fighting with his pride and his shame. He had started this as a careless promise, but now it had become a turning point. The girl's tears had forced everyone, especially him, to face the truth. Her music had failed, but her courage had not. Her tears had washed away the laughter, leaving only heavy silence and waiting hearts. And in that silence stood a little girl, broken yet unyielding, whispering the only thing she truly wanted: a chance to learn, a chance to be loved, a chance to belong. And the hall, filled with people of power and wealth, could do nothing but wait for the man who had made the promise to finally speak. From the back of the hall came a sound that broke the heavy silence. It was the voice of an old woman. Soft but firm, she rose slowly from her chair, leaning on a wooden cane. Her hair was silver and her eyes were sharp though tired. Everyone turned toward her. She pointed her cane gently in the girl's direction and said, "How could she know how to play? She has lived in the orphanage all her life." The words spread through the hall like a wave. People began to murmur again, but this time not with laughter. Instead, their voices carried guilt. The old woman's truth was undeniable. The girl was not unskilled because she was lazy. She was unskilled because no one had given her a chance. No teacher, no lessons, no encouragement, only silence and survival. The girl, still clutching the piano, looked at the old woman with wide, wet eyes. For a moment she felt seen, truly seen. She whispered softly, "It's true," and her voice cracked under the weight of it. Tears slipped down her cheeks again, but this time they carried less shame and more honesty. The crowd's reaction shifted. A few nodded slowly, realizing the cruelty of the situation. A man near the front whispered to his neighbor, "She was set up to fail." Another clenched his fist and muttered, "This isn't entertainment, this is cruel." The whispers grew, and the weight of judgment began to shift away from the child and toward the CEO who had made the careless promise. The CEO felt heat rise in his chest. For the first time, he did not feel powerful. He felt cornered. His words had turned against him. What had been meant as a light-hearted display now made him look like a man without compassion. His reputation, his pride, everything he had built with careful control, was being tested by the truth spoken by a frail old woman and the tears of a small girl. The girl's small hands gripped the edge of the piano. Harder. Her knuckles turned white. She did not speak, but her silence said enough. She stood there trembling, caught between fear and hope. She had heard the old woman defend her, and though she was still afraid, a small spark lit in her heart. For the first time in a long time, someone had told the world that her failure was not her fault. The old woman raised her voice again, stronger this time. What do you expect? From a child who was never taught, do you blame the flower for not blooming when no one watered it, or do you blame the ones who left it in the dark? Her words carried wisdom, and they pierced the air like arrows. The audience fell completely, silent, her question hanging in the air. Some people lowered their heads, ashamed that they had laughed earlier. A few even wiped tears from their eyes. The truth had broken the walls they had built around their hearts. They could no longer see the girl as a failure. They saw her now as a victim of neglect, and at the same time, as someone who had shown more courage than many adults would ever dare to show. The CEO's throat tightened. He stared at the piano, unable to look at the girl directly. The old woman's words echoed inside his mind. He thought of his own past, when he too had been left in the shadows. When no one had believed in him, he had fought his way out of poverty with nothing but willpower and stubbornness. But had he forgotten what it felt like to be helpless? Had he buried those memories so deeply that he could laugh at a child's pain? The girl whispered again, barely audible, "I want to learn." Her words reached the CEO like a knife to the heart. She was not asking for pity. She was asking for a chance. And suddenly he felt small in front of her courage. The old woman lowered her cane and sat back down slowly. Her role was done. She had spoken the truth and left the rest for the CEO to face. The hall waited, the silence thick and expectant. All eyes turned to him now. He was the man of power, the one who had made the bold promise. He could no longer laugh it away. He could no longer hide behind pride. The child had played, and though the music was broken, the courage was real. The girl's eyes looked up through tears, shining with a faint hope. Her body was shaking, her voice gone, but her heart was screaming. Silently for an answer, the audience felt it too. They leaned forward, waiting, almost holding their breath. The air was filled with the weight of a single decision. The CEO's chest rose and fell slowly. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. His jaw tightened. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet deep inside something began to break. It was the wall he had built around his heart long ago. The wall of pride, of wealth, of control. And through the cracks, he could feel something he had almost forgotten. Empathy. The girl's courage, the old woman's truth, and the silence of the crowd left him no escape. For the first time in years, he had to look into the mirror of his own soul. And in that mirror, he saw not a powerful man, but a boy who had once been laughed at, just like the girl in front of him. The room waited, silent and heavy. The girl's tears sparkled under the lights. The piano stood between her and the man who held her, fate. And in that moment it was clear to everyone, this was no longer about a game, no longer about a careless promise. It was about whether the CEO would rise to be more than his pride, or fall into the shame of his own cruelty. The next words from his mouth would decide not only her life, but his own place in the eyes of everyone watching. The hall was quiet, but inside the CEO's chest there was a storm. He sat in his chair with his hands gripping the armrests. His face was calm on the outside, but inside his heart was beating fast. The old woman's words repeated in his mind like an echo. "Do you blame the flower for not blooming when no one watered it?" He could not escape those words. They dug deep into his heart. He looked at the little girl standing by the piano. Her body was shaking, her small hands still clutching the edge as if it was the only thing keeping her from falling. Her tears rolled down her cheeks, but she did not run. She stayed there, waiting for an answer. That sight touched something buried inside him. something he had locked away for many years. Memories rose in his mind, sharp and painful. He saw himself as a boy, sitting in a broken classroom. His clothes were torn, and other children laughed at him. He remembered the times when he wanted to learn, but no one helped him. He remembered the shame of being poor, the endless hunger, the feeling that the world was against him. Back then he had promised himself that he would grow powerful. He would rise so high that no one could laugh at him again. And he had done it. He had built an empire. He had money, power, respect. But in building those walls, he had buried the child he once was. Now, as he looked at the little girl, he saw that same child, trembling, crying, mocked by strangers, and his chest tightened. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. Her courage kept him staring. She was facing what he once faced, but unlike him, she had no shield, no armor of pride, no wealth to protect her. She only had the courage to stand there and whisper, "I want to learn." The audience waited. Some were whispering softly, others sat frozen. Everyone knew that the moment was no longer entertainment. It had become something heavier, deeper. The CEO felt the weight of all those eyes on him. He was not used to being judged. He was always the one in control, but now he was the one being tested. His mind fought with itself. One part told him to escape, to laugh it off, to say it was just a joke. That way he could protect his pride. Another part whispered that if he turned away now, he would lose something far more important than pride. He would lose his humanity. The girl had shown more strength than he had. She had stood in front of everyone with nothing but courage. Could he not do the same? The girl lifted her eyes. Her face was wet, her lips trembling, but her eyes were filled with a strange light, a desperate hope. She was not begging for gifts or money. She was begging for a chance to belong, a chance to be loved. That look pierced straight through him. He felt his throat tighten. He wanted to speak, but the words stuck. He remembered the promise he had made in front of everyone. If she plays, I'll adopt her. At first it had been just a game, a line to make him look bold, but now it was real. She had played, not beautifully, not perfectly, but honestly, with all the courage she had. She had kept her side of the promise. Could he break his? The hall seemed to shrink around him. The silence pressed on his shoulders, forcing him to act. He took a deep breath. His heart told him one thing, his pride another. He had lived his life listening to pride, but tonight something different was pulling at him. Finally, he stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound made the entire hall jump. All eyes turned to him. The girl's body stiffened, her hands gripping the piano tighter. She was afraid of what he might say, afraid of rejection, afraid of hearing the laughter start again. The CEO's lips parted, but no sound came. He closed, his eyes for a second forcing down the lump in his throat. When he opened them again, his gaze softened. For the first time that night, his face showed no pride, no arrogance, only truth. He whispered to himself before speaking louder. She doesn't need to prove anything. His voice shook, but he continued louder now. I was wrong. Gasps filled the hall. People leaned forward, some covered their mouths in shock. No, one had expected the powerful man to admit a mistake, but he had. His voice trembled, but it carried through the silence. She doesn't need to play to deserve love, he said. His eyes stayed on the girl. I was wrong to make it a game. The girl blinked through her tears, not sure if she had heard him correctly. Her lips parted, her breath catching in her chest. The CEO stepped forward slowly. His heavy shoes echoed on the wooden floor. He approached the piano where she stood. She looked so small, so fragile, her eyes wide with fear and hope mixed together. When he reached her, he knelt slightly so he would not tower over her. His voice was softer now, only for her. You don't have to play. You already showed more courage than anyone in this room. The girl's tears fell harder. Her lips trembled as she whispered, Really? The CEO nodded. His eyes stung. With his own unshed tears, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Yes, really. The hall was silent again, but it was a different silence now. It was not cruel or heavy. It was filled with emotion. Some people were already crying. Others clapped softly, moved by the moment. The little girl who had walked onto the stage as nothing more than an orphan now stood in the center of a storm that had changed everything. And in that moment, the CEO realized something he had forgotten long ago. True power was not in money, not in pride, not in making others laugh. True power was in lifting someone who had nothing, in giving them a chance, in remembering the child he once was, and for the first time in many years he felt human again. The crowd inside the hall waited, every pair of eyes fixed on the man who had just stood up and admitted he was wrong. The CEO, who was always known for his power, his pride, and his cold smile, now looked different. His voice was softer, his eyes less sharp. His words had already shocked the room, but everyone wanted to know what he would do next. The little girl stood trembling beside the piano. Her small fingers still clutched the wooden edge as if it was the only safe thing in the world. She looked up at him with eyes filled with fear and hope. Her tears shone under the lights, but she did not wipe them away this time. She was waiting, her heart beating so fast it hurt. The CEO took another step closer. His shadow fell over her, but his presence no longer felt heavy or cruel. He reached out his hand slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "You don't have to prove anything," he said again. His voice was steady this time. "You have already proven more than I ever asked for." The girl's lips trembled. She wanted to believe him, but her life had taught her that promises often broke, that words could turn sharp in a second. She whispered in a voice so soft it was almost lost, "Will you still keep your promise?" Her question pierced the air, and the audience leaned forward to hear his answer. The CEO looked at her for a long moment. His chest rose and fell. His pride wanted to hesitate, but his heart had already made the decision. He bent down slightly so his eyes were level with hers and said, "Yes, I will keep my promise. Not because you played well, but because you were brave, I will adopt you. Not for your talent, but for your courage." The hall gasped again. A wave of whispers spread across the room. Some people clapped their hands softly, moved by the honesty of his words. Others wiped away tears. The girl's eyes widened, her tears spilling faster now. She could hardly believe what she had heard. Her voice shook as she asked, "Really, you mean it?" The CEO nodded slowly. His hand gently rested on her thin shoulder. "Yes," he said firmly. "From today, you are not alone." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime for her. She had been abandoned, ignored, and laughed at all her life. And now, in one moment, she was promised a home. The girl let out a small sob, her hands flying to her face. She cried not from shame this time, but from relief, from hope, from something she had never felt before. People in the hall could not hold back their emotions. Some clapped louder now, others stood from their seats. The old woman who had spoken earlier nodded with tears in her eyes, whispering, "Good, very good." The CEO lifted the girl gently into his arms. She was so light it startled him, like lifting a bundle of feathers. She wrapped her arms around his neck tightly as if afraid he might disappear. Her tears wet his expensive suit, but he did not care. He felt something inside him heal as he held her, a wound from his childhood that had been hidden for years. The crowd rose to their feet in applause. The sound filled the hall, no longer cruel, no longer mocking. It was warm, it was strong. It was for her, and for him too. The girl buried her face in his shoulder, trembling, unable to stop crying. The CEO patted her back gently, whispering, "It's all right. You're safe now." The people in the hall would never forget that sight. A man who had once spoken with arrogance now stood carrying a little girl with tenderness. A child who had once been mocked now clung to a promise that would change her life. The stage that had been filled with broken notes and cruel laughter now glowed with something greater, hope. The CEO turned to face the audience, his arm still holding the girl. His voice was firm again, but different. It carried not pride, but sincerity. "I made a mistake tonight," he said. "I treated her life as if it was a game. But she showed me courage, more than I ever had at her age. and I will not turn away from that. From this day forward, she is my daughter." The applause grew louder. People shouted words of encouragement. Some even cried openly. The girl lifted her face from his shoulder, her eyes red and swollen but filled with light. She looked around the hall, and for the first time she did not see enemies. She saw people clapping for her, believing in her. The CEO felt a strange warmth in his chest, something he had not felt in years. It was pride, but not the cold pride of wealth. It was the warm pride of doing the right thing. He held the girl tighter, promising himself that he would never let her feel abandoned again. The little girl whispered in his ear, her voice still shaky but filled with hope. "Thank you." He smiled softly and answered, "No, thank you. You reminded me who I am." The hall stood as one, the sound of clapping echoing like thunder. The moment was no longer about a challenge or a promise. It was about change, about love, about second chances. And in the middle of it all, a poor girl who once pressed broken keys on an old piano was now held safely in the arms of the man who promised her a new life. A man who had finally understood. The true strength was not in wealth or pride, but in keeping a promise and opening his heart. The hall was still ringing with applause. People stood from their seats, some clapping, some wiping their eyes, and some shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. The air that had once been heavy with laughter and cruelty now felt warm and alive. In the middle of it all, the CEO held the girl in his arms, and for the first time in years he did not feel empty. He felt complete. The girl clung to him tightly, her face buried against his shoulder. She was still crying, but her tears had changed. They were no longer filled with shame and pain. They were tears of relief, tears of hope. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen her, not because of what she could do, not because of her talent, but because of who she was. For a child who had known nothing but rejection, this moment felt like magic. The CEO stepped down from the stage slowly, his arms carrying her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The crowd moved aside to let him pass. Some reached out to touch his arm, whispering words of support. Others bent down to smile at the girl, telling her softly, "You are brave. You are strong." The girl peeked out shyly from his shoulder, her wet eyes wide with surprise. She had never been spoken to like this before. As they reached the doors of the hall, the CEO paused. He turned to face the people one last time. His voice was steady, stronger now. "We often forget that children are not here to entertain us. They are here to be loved, to be taught, to be given a chance." His words echoed across the room, and many nodded, moved by the truth of them. Then he turned and walked out, carrying the girl into a new chapter of both their lives. Outside, the night was cool and calm. The street lamps glowed faintly, and the city was quiet. The CEO placed the girl gently into his car. She looked around with wide eyes, her small hands touching the leather seat as if she had stepped into another world. He sat beside her and closed the door. The driver started the car, but inside, the girl's world was spinning. She whispered softly, "Is this real?" afraid that if she spoke too loudly, it might all disappear. The CEO turned to her, his eyes soft. "Yes, it's real," he said. "From now on, you are not alone." The girl looked at him carefully, searching his face to see if there was any sign of a joke. But all she saw was truth. Her lips trembled, and she whispered again, "Will you really let me learn? Will you let me play the piano one day?" Her question was timid, filled with both hope and fear. The CEO's chest tightened. He nodded slowly. "Yes, you will have the best teachers. You will play, not because you have to, but because you love it, and no one will laugh at you again." The girl's eyes filled with tears once more, but this time her tears carried light. She pressed her hands together tightly as if holding on to the promise. The car drove through the quiet streets, and the girl leaned against him, her small body finally relaxing after so much fear. She was tired, her eyelids heavy. Slowly she drifted to sleep, her head resting on his chest. The CEO looked down at her, listening to her soft breathing. and for the first time in years, his heart felt at peace. When they arrived at his home, the servants rushed forward, shocked to see him carrying a child. They whispered to each other, confused, but he silenced them with one look. "This is my daughter," he said firmly. The words carried power, and no one dared to question him. The girl stirred in his arms but did not wake. He carried her inside and laid her gently on a bed softer than anything she had ever known. She curled up instantly, clutching the blanket like it was a treasure. The CEO stood by her side, watching her sleep. His mind replayed the entire night, the laughter, the broken notes, the old woman's words, her tears, her courage. And he realized that tonight had changed him as much as it had changed her. He had walked into that hall as a man of pride, but he had walked out as a father. The next morning, when the girl awoke, she found sunlight spilling into the room. She blinked at the soft sheets, the warm blanket, the quiet hum of the house. For a moment she thought it was a dream, but then she heard footsteps. The CEO walked in with a gentle smile, carrying a tray of food. "Good morning," he said softly. "You are home now." The girl sat up slowly, her eyes wide. She whispered, "Home," tasting the word as if it was the sweetest thing she had ever said. Tears filled her eyes again, but they were tears of joy. She nodded, smiling through them. The CEO placed the tray in front of her, and for the first time in her life, she ate without fear. From that day forward, her life began to change. She was given teachers not only for the piano but for reading and writing. She was given clothes that fit her, meals that filled her, and a bed that was always warm. But most importantly, she was given love. Each night she would whisper, "Thank you," and each time the CEO would answer, "No, thank you." Years later, when she finally played the piano, again the notes that once sounded broken now filled the house with beauty. She played not to prove herself, but because her heart was free. And as the CEO listened, tears filled his eyes. He knew that night at the charity hall had been the true beginning, not just for her, but for him too. And so the story of a careless promise turned into a new life. A man who once smiled in pride had found humility, and a girl who once trembled in fear had found family. Together they wrote a new song, one not made of broken notes, but of courage, love, and belonging. And that song would never fade.